The Senate chamber was never meant to feel like a battlefield, yet that afternoon it carried the air of one. The mahogany desks, polished to a shine, looked less like instruments of governance and more like shields in a war of words. John Neely Kennedy sat upright, his notes stacked neatly before him, but his eyes weren't on the papers. They were locked on Chuck Schumer, the majority leader, who stood across the chamber exuding the confidence of a man too long accustomed to unchecked power. Kennedy knew the moment had to land hard, sharp, unforgettable. For months he had watched Schumer twist procedure, bury transparency, and wield influence like a weapon for friends and donors. Every senator in the room felt it, some resented it, but few dared say it aloud. Kennedy would. When he rose, his voice cut through the chamber like a clean blade. "Mr. Schumer," he began, his Louisiana drawl calm but carrying weight, "you've built an empire not on leadership, not on integrity, but on favors and fear. That may work in the shadows, but today, I'll call it what it is." Schumer's head tilted, a smirk tugging at his lips, the kind of smirk that said he'd heard every insult before. But Kennedy wasn't throwing an insult. He was branding him. Kennedy leaned forward, his words deliberate, "You are the godfather of corruption." The phrase detonated like dynamite in the chamber. Gasps erupted from the gallery, aides froze mid-scribble, and cameras, always watching, zoomed in closer. For a heartbeat, even Schumer's mask of confidence slipped, his smirk tightening into a grimace. Kennedy didn't flinch. He knew the rules of storytelling, the weight of a strong opening. This wasn't just a speech. It was Act One of a confrontation that would ripple far beyond those walls. He let the silence stretch, every eye locked on him, before driving the moment home. This country doesn't belong to political kingpins or power brokers. It belongs to the people. And they deserve to know the truth. The chamber buzzed with whispers, the clash of power and principle now inevitable. Kennedy had thrown the first strike. The battle line was drawn. The silence after Kennedy's charge didn't last long. Schumer, never one to let himself appear cornered, rose from his seat with deliberate calm. His tailored suit, his polished shoes, even the way he adjusted his glasses all signaled authority. He had been in Washington too long, seen too many storms, to let one senator rattle him, or so he thought. "Senator Kennedy," Schumer began, his tone dripping with controlled disdain, "I'll chalk your words up to theater. The American people expect leadership, not circus acts." His voice echoed, smooth and practiced, the voice of a man who had made deals in smoke-filled rooms for decades. He turned slightly to the cameras, a faint smile playing across his lips, as if Kennedy's accusation had already been reduced to a soundbite. But Kennedy didn't retreat. He had been waiting for this. Schumer's predictable deflection. Kennedy leaned forward, hands resting firmly on his desk. "Theater?" His voice was calm but edged with steel. "What you call theater, Mr. Schumer, folks back home call honesty. They call it finally saying what everybody already knows but's too scared to admit." The chamber stirred again. Senators shifted uneasily, aides whispered to their bosses. The words weren't just hanging in the air, they were cutting. Kennedy's bluntness was breaking through the polished marble walls of Washington decorum. He pressed on, his voice rising slightly, just enough to carry urgency. "While you sit in backrooms carving up favors like a butcher with meat, families in Louisiana, in Iowa, in Ohio, they're wondering how they'll pay for groceries this week. And you stand there acting like corruption's just politics as usual." Schumer tried to interrupt, but Kennedy's drawl overpowered him. "You may be the godfather of corruption, but I'll be damned if I let you pretend this is business as usual. Not today. Not anymore." The tension was electric. Journalists in the gallery scribbled furiously, knowing headlines were writing themselves. Kennedy had turned Schumer's dismissal into fuel, and every word tightened the noose around the majority leader's carefully cultivated image. The chamber wasn't a theater, Kennedy thought, it was a reckoning. And Schumer had just been cast in the role of villain. The chamber's air grew heavier, as though the marble columns themselves were leaning in to witness the clash. Schumer, visibly tightening his jaw, tried to reclaim the rhythm. He adjusted his notes and launched into a rehearsed defense. "Senator Kennedy," he said smoothly, "you speak of backroom deals, but governance requires negotiation. Compromise is not corruption, it's leadership. Without it, this nation collapses into chaos." His words, polished like a courtroom argument, were meant for the cameras, not for the man across the aisle. But Kennedy wasn't swayed. He rose to his feet, his frame steady, his gaze fixed on Schumer like a man staring down a storm. "Compromise?" Kennedy's tone sharpened. "There's a world of difference between compromise and selling the American people down the river. One's about finding common ground. The other's about pocketing favors, bowing to lobbyists, and pretending it's all in the people's best interest." A murmur rippled through the Senate floor. Some senators shifted uncomfortably, others leaned forward, sensing history in the making. Kennedy's words weren't just accusations, they were stripping the varnish off decades of Washington's polished lies. He didn't let the moment breathe. His hand slapped lightly against the desk, punctuating each word. "Families back home can't compromise with an empty fridge. They can't negotiate with a pink slip. And they sure can't survive the kind of corruption you've dressed up as leadership for 40 years. Schumer opened his mouth to object, but Kennedy's southern drawl cut sharper. "So, Mr. Schumer, when you call yourself a leader, let's be clear, you're not leading America forward. You're dragging it into the swamp. And I, for one, will not stand by while you play the Godfather and call it democracy." The gallery erupted, some gasps, some applause quickly hushed by the sergeant at arms. Cameras zoomed in. The story was no longer about two senators trading jabs, it was about truth versus deception, plain speech versus polished lies. Kennedy hadn't just challenged Schumer, he had stripped away his armor, leaving him exposed before the nation. The silence that followed was suffocating. For a brief moment, Schumer's practiced grin faltered, replaced by a flicker of unease. He quickly masked it with indignation, slamming his palm against the lectern. "How dare you, Senator Kennedy," he thundered, his voice reverberating off the chamber walls. "I have served this nation for decades, and I will not be slandered by cheap theatrics." The roar echoed, but it lacked conviction. Everyone in the chamber knew Schumer's outrage was not for Kennedy, but for the cameras, an attempt to control the narrative before it spiraled out of his grasp. He straightened his tie, squared his shoulders, and tried to command authority. But Kennedy, unmoved, leaned forward in his chair with the quiet composure of a man who had nothing to lose and nothing to hide. "Mr. Schumer," Kennedy replied calmly, his drawl thick and deliberate, slicing through the tension like a hot knife through butter, "you can yell, you can pound the table, and you can hide behind speeches polished by your staff. But no volume in the world can drown out the truth." He paused, letting the weight of silence work in his favor. "And the truth is this, when Americans look at their leaders, they don't see public servants anymore, they see political royalty. And who sits at the head of that rotten table? The Godfather himself, Chuck Schumer." Gasps spread across the room like a wave. Even senators who normally avoided confrontation glanced nervously between the two men, unsure whether to intervene or let the spectacle unfold. The press gallery scribbled furiously, knowing they were witnessing a soundbite that would dominate the headlines for weeks. Schumer's face reddened, his fury barely contained. But Kennedy pressed on, his tone rising now with righteous anger. "You've built a career not on serving the people, but on serving yourself. On cutting deals in the dark and cashing favors in the daylight. And every American family struggling tonight knows exactly what kind of godfather you are." The chamber trembled, not from Schumer's rage, but from Kennedy's relentless assault. What had begun as political theater was turning into a trial, with Schumer in the defendant's chair and Kennedy as both prosecutor and voice of the people. The chamber buzzed with restless energy, the weight of Kennedy's words settling over senators, staffers, and press alike. For the first time in years, Schumer looked cornered, not by another polished politician, but by raw truth delivered with a southern grit that no spin doctor could polish away. He adjusted his glasses, his voice trembling just enough to betray the pressure. "Senator Kennedy, these accusations are reckless and dangerous. You're undermining faith in our democracy." Kennedy's lips curled into a wry half-smile, the kind that said he'd been waiting for that line. He leaned into the microphone, his voice low but razor-sharp. "Faith in democracy, Mr. Schumer, doesn't die because I tell the truth. It dies when leaders like you sell it to the highest bidder." The chamber erupted. Some senators whispered furiously, others sat frozen, afraid to be seen applauding or condemning. Kennedy rose slowly from his seat, his figure commanding the room. "You talk about serving the people, but who exactly are the people to you? The Wall Street banks that pour millions into your campaigns? The lobbyists who write your bills before they ever hit the floor? Or is it the hard-working families of this country who haven't seen you walk their streets in decades?" His voice grew louder, carrying a cadence that felt less like a senator's speech and more like a closing argument. Schumer tried to cut in, but Kennedy's momentum was unstoppable. "You call yourself a public servant. I call you what you are, the Godfather of Corruption. The man who turned politics into a family business and the Capitol into a casino." The words struck like thunder, rolling through the chamber and leaving a stunned hush in their wake. Cameras zoomed in, capturing Schumer's tightened jaw and Kennedy's unflinching stare. The image was iconic, one man clinging to the crumbling walls of power, the other standing tall, speaking not just for Louisiana, but for every American who felt betrayed. Kennedy didn't need a script, didn't need applause. His power came from conviction, from a voice that carried the raw weight of truth. And in that moment, even Schumer's allies knew, the Godfather had been named, and the people were listening. The ripple effect from Kennedy's declaration spread like wildfire beyond the chamber. Within hours, every major news outlet ran the clip on repeat, Kennedy leaning into the mic, calling Schumer, the Godfather of Corruption. The words burned across the screen like a headline carved in stone. Cable anchors scrambled to frame it, pundits clashed, and social media exploded. Some accused Kennedy of being reckless, others hailed him as the only man bold enough to speak the truth. But while the nation argued, Schumer retreated behind the fortress of his office, surrounded by advisors who whispered damage control strategies like panicked lieutenants after a lost battle. One urged him to deny everything, another to attack Kennedy's credibility, yet Schumer's silence told the story. He knew the senator from Louisiana had struck a nerve too deep to bandage. Kennedy, meanwhile, returned to his constituents, not as a celebrity, but as a servant. At a town hall in Baton Rouge, he faced a packed room of factory workers, teachers, and single mothers. The applause shook the walls, but Kennedy raised his hands for quiet. "I didn't come here for cheers," he said, his voice steady. "I came here because you deserve honesty. Washington is rotten, and I won't stop until the rot is cut out." He told stories, not statistics, not policy jargon, but real lives. He spoke of farmers crushed by unfair trade deals, families drowning in healthcare bills, veterans ignored after service. While Chuck Schumer throws banquets for lobbyists, Kennedy thundered, "Ordinary Americans eat the crumbs. And I say enough." The crowd erupted, not with polite applause, but with a roar of recognition. Back in Washington, Schumer's allies scrambled to counter Kennedy's rising tide, yet their statements rang hollow, coated in the same polished evasions that had lost the people's trust long ago. The more they attacked Kennedy, the stronger he grew, because he wasn't speaking to the elite. He was speaking to America. And for the first time in decades, the people felt that someone in the marble halls of power was willing to call the corruption by its name. By the next week, the battle lines were clear. Kennedy had become a lightning rod, loved or hated, but never ignored. Talk radio hosts replayed his words with fire in their voices. Grassroots groups printed T-shirts and posters with the phrase, "Godfather of Corruption," stamped across Schumer's silhouette. Meanwhile, Washington insiders sneered, dismissing Kennedy as a populist grandstander. But deep down, they feared him. Because unlike others, Kennedy didn't play by their rules. On Capitol Hill, Schumer tried to stage a counterattack. At a press conference, he stood flanked by loyal allies, his voice dripping with indignation. Senator Kennedy's words were reckless, Schumer declared, and dangerous for our democracy. The cameras clicked, the sound bites rolled, but something was missing. The passion felt manufactured, the outrage hollow. Reporters scribbled notes, but their questions pierced through the facade. Senator, what about the donations? The lobbyist dinners? The contracts tied to your campaign? Schumer dodged, pivoted, and blamed partisan theatrics. But the seed of doubt had already taken root. While Schumer waited in spin, Kennedy was on the Senate floor again, voice echoing through the chamber. The American people don't care about your indignation, Chuck. They care about why their rent's rising, why their groceries cost double, why their kids are buried in debt before they even get a chance. And they want to know why you're too busy dining with billionaires to notice. The speech wasn't polished, it was raw, even jagged, but it was real. Every pause, every hard edge, carried the weight of a man who had spent more time in diners than in donor galas. The gallery, usually half empty, was packed with visitors who'd waited in line just to watch Kennedy speak truth to power. Some wiped away tears, others sat rigid, fists clenched, like they were hearing their own frustrations finally voiced. And while pundits on TV argued whether Kennedy was crossing a line, the people watching at home didn't see a reckless man. They saw courage. They saw someone who dared to call the empire of corruption by its name. And once the truth has been spoken, it cannot be unsaid. The storm only grew fiercer. Major newspapers ran headlines casting the showdown as Kennedy versus Schumer, the fight for Washington's soul. Cable news networks aired split screens. On one side, Schumer smiling at a high-dollar fundraiser with Wall Street executives, on the other, Kennedy standing in a muddy Louisiana field with farmers, listening, nodding, boots sinking in the wet soil. The contrast spoke louder than any pundit ever could. Schumer doubled down, accusing Kennedy of waging class warfare. His polished sound bites were clipped, practiced, designed to shield him. But they rang hollow outside the marble halls of D.C. In living rooms across America, working families laughed bitterly at the accusation. Class warfare? They thought. We didn't start this war. We're just surviving it. Meanwhile, Kennedy wasn't finished. In a fiery Senate hearing on government waste, he leaned across the microphone, his voice sharp as a blade. Chuck, you can call me reckless, you can call me loud, but you can't call me wrong. The people of this country are drowning, and while they sink, you're busy handing out life jackets to your donors. Gasps rippled through the chamber. Some senators shifted uncomfortably in their seats, others stared at their papers pretending not to listen. But the cameras caught every second. Clips of that moment spread like wildfire online. Students, truck drivers, veterans, single moms, they all shared it with captions like, "Finally, someone said it." The phrase, "Godfather of Corruption," became more than a headline. It became a rallying cry. Protest signs, hashtags, memes, it was everywhere, echoing through a nation hungry for honesty. And in that moment, it wasn't just Kennedy versus Schumer. It was Kennedy versus the machine itself, a machine built on lobbyists, loopholes, and lies. And for the first time in a long time, the machine looked afraid. The walls of the Capitol trembled not from any earthquake, but from the roar of voices rising outside. Thousands had gathered on the steps, waving signs that read, "Drain the swamp," and "No more Godfathers of Corruption." The air was electric, thick with chants that rolled like thunder through the streets of Washington. Reporters scrambled through the crowd, their cameras capturing the raw energy of a people who'd had enough. Inside, Chuck Schumer stood at a podium, adjusting his tie with the precision of a man who believed appearances could save him. His speech was polished, rehearsed, a lecture on responsible governance and the dangers of populist rhetoric. But the words fell flat. Even through the cameras, viewers could see it, his eyes darting, his jaw tight. For the first time, Schumer looked less like a kingmaker and more like a cornered man. Kennedy, by contrast, was out in the open air, standing shoulder to shoulder with the people. The crowd erupted when he took the microphone. "You've been lied to long enough," he thundered, his southern drawl slicing through the noise. "They call it politics, I call it theft. They say it's compromise, I say it's corruption. And if that makes me the enemy of the Godfather, then I'll wear that badge with pride." The crowd roared so loud that even inside the Capitol, Schumer's staffers froze. The chants shook the marble walls, "Kennedy! Kennedy! Kennedy!" It wasn't just a name, it was defiance, a declaration of war against the old order. That night, primetime anchors debated whether this was the beginning of a political revolution. Some dismissed it as spectacle. Others warned of chaos. But to the millions watching online, none of that mattered. What mattered was the image seared into their memory: Kennedy standing tall with the people, Schumer trembling behind the podium. And in that split-screen America, the truth was impossible to hide. The sun had long set over Washington, but the echoes of that day refused to die. Across living rooms, diners, and city streets, people replayed the footage: Kennedy's fiery words, Schumer's strained expression, the chants of the crowd shaking the Capitol like a storm. It wasn't just a political skirmish anymore, it was a symbol, a line drawn in the sand between two Americas. Schumer tried damage control. His office released statements painting Kennedy as reckless, even dangerous. Sympathetic pundits echoed the talking points, calling him a provocateur with no respect for institutions. But the narrative was already out of their hands. Memes flooded social media, depicting Schumer as a mafia boss clutching bags of taxpayer money. Hashtags like #Godfather of Corruption and #Kennedy for Truth trended for days. Meanwhile, Kennedy refused to retreat. He doubled down, not with slick PR campaigns, but with raw honesty. On a late-night town hall broadcast, he faced voters directly: farmers, veterans, single parents, people who knew the sting of broken promises. "I'm not here to polish marble or make speeches that sound good in the swamp," he said. "I'm here to fight for you. If that means calling out corruption, even if it wears an expensive suit and runs the Senate, then that's what I'll do." The room erupted in applause, but it wasn't the applause of spectacle. It was the sound of people recognizing something rare: authenticity. By week's end, a new poll stunned Washington insiders. For the first time, Kennedy had vaulted ahead of Schumer in national favorability. Analysts scrambled to explain it. Some blamed populist anger, others called it a media stunt. But ordinary Americans knew better. They'd seen the mask slip. Schumer was no longer untouchable. The myth of the Godfather had been shattered. And in its place stood Kennedy, not just as a senator from Louisiana, but as the voice of a rebellion long overdue. The question now was not whether Kennedy had won a battle. It was whether he had ignited a movement. Ladies and gentlemen, what you've just witnessed is more than politics. This is about truth versus lies, courage versus corruption. Chuck Schumer built an empire of backroom deals and back-scratching favors. But tonight, that empire was shaken by one man's refusal to bow down. John Neely Kennedy stood firm, not for power, not for fame, but for the people who've been ignored for too long. He showed us that one honest voice can pierce through the noise of Washington's swamp and call out the Godfather of Corruption himself. And so I ask you, whose side are you on? The polished king of the swamp who hides behind smoke and mirrors, or the fighter from Louisiana who dares to speak the truth? History is not written by those who whisper. It is written by those who stand. Kennedy stood. And America heard him.